In the small weathered town of Port Harbor, Maine, life was dictated by the ebb and flow of the tide. For Ethan, a young fisherman whose life was as predictable as the morning sun, the ocean was his only companion. Since his parents passed, he had inherited their small two-bedroom cottage and his father's old fishing boat. He spent his days hauling nets, his hands calloused from the rough ropes and his face weathered by the salty wind. He was hard-working and honest, but his simple life made him an invisible man in the eyes of the town's young women. Every time he tried to approach a girl, the answer was always the same. "I need more than a boat and a cottage, Ethan," one said to him. "I want a life, not just a living." He understood their point. They wanted a man with a steady, salaried job, a man who didn't smell of fish and salt water at the end of every day. The loneliness was a heavy anchor in his heart, pulling him down every time he saw a couple walking hand in hand along the docks at sunset. But then there was Officer Sarah Hayes. She wasn't from Port Harbor. She was a Coast Guard officer, reassigned here from a bustling city, and she carried herself with the kind of professionalism and poise that made her seem untouchable. Her uniform was always crisp, her boots shined, and her eyes were a sharp, intelligent blue. Ethan knew she was the kind of woman he'd never even dream of approaching. She was a symbol of everything he wasn't: stability, authority, a world far removed from his small town. Her job often required her to check on the remote, rocky islands scattered off the coast, and for these missions, she would charter a local boat. It was a simple business transaction, nothing more. "Ethan," she would say with a curt nod, her voice all business, "I need a ride to that rock formation about 3 miles out." He would take her there, the silence between them as vast as the sea itself. He knew she was off limits, a beautiful ghost in his small world. Yet, with every trip, his fascination grew. He admired the way she handled herself, how she moved with confidence, and the fierce intelligence he saw in her eyes. He was just a fisherman, a forgotten man in a forgotten town, but he couldn't get her out of his mind. He was desperate for her to see him as something more than just a man who drove a boat. And in his desperation, a reckless, dangerous idea began to form in his mind. A plan that would either bring them together or destroy them both. He would find a way to make her see him. Days turned into weeks, and the trips with Officer Hayes became a predictable ritual. She would meet him at the dock, her gaze fixed on the horizon, a map in her hands. Their conversations were always brief and to the point, just a simple exchange about the day's destination. She was a professional through and through, and Ethan was just a means to an end. It was the emotional distance between them that was suffocating him. He would try to make her laugh, to get her to open up, but she would just give a polite, distant smile and turn her attention back to the sea. His feelings for her only grew with each passing trip. He saw past the crisp uniform and the cool demeanor, sensing a loneliness in her eyes that mirrored his own. But how could he, a simple fisherman, bridge the gap between them? The women of his town had already made their feelings clear, and she was in a different league entirely. This was why his mind kept returning to his desperate idea, the one he knew was crazy, but felt was his only hope. He started paying closer attention to her work schedule. He noticed that every few months, she was assigned to patrol the most isolated islands, places that were far from any shipping lanes or common routes. These were the trips she often took alone, to assess the true condition of the remote outposts. This was his chance. One blustery morning, Sarah arrived at the dock earlier than usual. "Ethan," she said, her voice firm against the wind, "I need to go to Stone Rock. I have a long day of checks and I won't be back until sunset." Ethan's heart leaped. Stone Rock was one of the most remote, barren islands in the area, a place with no regular visitors. This was the moment. "Right away, officer," he said, his voice betraying none of the turmoil inside him. As Sarah turned to check her gear, he moved swiftly. With a small, pre-selected wrench he had hidden under a tarp, he began to discreetly loosen a critical bolt on his boat's engine. It was an old engine, easy enough to tamper with. He made sure the damage wasn't immediately visible, but significant enough to guarantee a breakdown. The trip to Stone Rock was long and silent. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and twisted excitement. He was committing to a risky, possibly illegal act. What if they never got rescued? What if she hated him for this? He pushed the thoughts away. It was a risk he was willing to take. He believed that if she just had to spend time with him, truly see him, she would come to understand. After about an hour of her work on the island, Sarah returned, her face tired but satisfied. "All right, Ethan, we're done here. Let's head back." He nodded, put the boat in gear, and turned the key. The engine coughed once, sputtered violently, and then fell silent. He tried again, and again, but the engine was dead. He faked a frantic expression, fumbling with the engine cover and pretending to check the parts. "No, no, no," he muttered to himself, his voice laced with feigned panic. "Something's wrong. It's completely dead." Sarah walked over, her face a mask of concern. "What do you mean dead?" she asked, her voice sharp. He looked at her with wide eyes. "I'm not sure. It's completely shot. I don't think I can fix it out here." The wind picked up and a few drops of rain began to fall. The reality of their situation sank in, a cold wave washing over them. They were stranded on an island in the middle of the ocean, with a storm on the way. His reckless plan had worked. Now all he had to do was hope it was worth the consequences. The silence that followed the engine's final sputter was more deafening than any storm. Officer Sarah Hayes, her face a mask of disbelief and frustration, stared from the dead engine to Ethan's apologetic expression. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice low and sharp. "My radio's out of range. My phone has no signal. I'm stranded on a rock with no way to contact anyone." Ethan held up his hands in a helpless gesture. "I swear, Sarah, I don't know what happened. It just gave out." Sarah turned away from him, her gaze scanning the barren coastline. The setting sun cast an eerie orange glow, and the wind began to whip at her uniform. She was a professional. She had trained for emergencies, but this was different. She wasn't on a mission. She was a victim of circumstance, with the only other person around being the very man she had to trust. The thought was infuriating. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice strained. "The tide will rise, and the storm is coming." Ethan, who knew the island far better than she did, pointed toward a cluster of trees. "There's a small cave on the other side. It's safe and dry. We should go." They walked in tense silence, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel. Sarah led the way, her officer's instincts taking over. She moved with purpose, her frustration barely contained. She had trained her whole life to be self-sufficient, and now she was at the mercy of a broken boat and a man she barely knew. They reached the cave just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. It was small, damp, and smelled of earth, but it was shelter. Sarah went inside first, her hand instinctively on her sidearm, a habit born of years of training. She was a police officer, always ready for a threat, but here, the only threat was a broken boat and a quiet fisherman who had looked at her with sadness in his eyes. Ethan, seeing her unease, busied himself with gathering dry branches and leaves to build a small fire. "I'll make sure you're warm," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. Sarah leaned against the cold rock wall, her arms crossed over her chest. The fire began to sputter to life, casting dancing shadows on their faces. "Don't get any ideas, Ethan," she warned, her voice firm and cold. "This is a rescue situation, nothing more." Ethan looked at her, his eyes serious. "I know, Sarah. I'm not a threat to you. I'm just here to make sure we both get through this." He didn't meet her gaze for long, instead turning back to the fire. The night stretched on, filled with the roar of the wind and the crackling of the fire. Sarah stayed awake for hours, her mind racing. She was a police officer, a beacon of order in a chaotic world. But tonight, on this tiny, isolated island, there was no order, no rules. It was just her, the sea, and a man who was her only hope. The fear was a quiet, suffocating presence in the back of her mind. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they weren't getting off this island anytime soon. They would have to survive, together. The morning after the storm broke was a calm one. The sun rose over the vast ocean, and the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. Sarah and Ethan emerged from the cave, their clothes damp, their spirits tired. The air was fresh and clean, but the sight of the empty sea where their boat once sat was a stark reminder of their reality. There was no one coming for them, not yet. Sarah knew she couldn't afford to be angry. Her professional training kicked in. She was a survivor, but she didn't have the skills for this particular situation. She looked at Ethan, who seemed completely at ease in the wild. He was a fisherman, a man of the sea and land. In this new world, he was the leader. "First, we need water and food," Ethan said, his voice quiet but confident. "The cave is a good shelter, but we can't stay there all day." He led her through the dense foliage, pointing out things she never would have noticed. "This is a freshwater spring," he explained, pointing to a small trickle of water from a rock. "It's safe to drink." He taught her which berries were safe to eat, how to identify poisonous plants, and how to find edible roots. As a city girl, Sarah was used to getting her food from a supermarket. Here, every meal was a hard-won victory. He also taught her how to fish without a rod, using a long, sturdy stick and some fibrous plant material for a line. He created a crude spear. "It takes patience," he said as he demonstrated the technique. "You have to be one with the water." Sarah, used to a world of firearms and high-tech equipment, found the simplicity of it both frustrating and humbling. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into months. Their daily rhythm was a simple, primal dance of survival. They would wake up at sunrise, forage for food, fish in the clear waters, and work on making their small camp more comfortable. Sarah's initial anger slowly dissipated, replaced by a quiet, determined resolve. She stopped complaining and started asking questions, soaking up every piece of knowledge Ethan shared. She learned how to start a fire by rubbing two sticks together, how to track small animals, and how to read the clouds to predict the weather. As they worked side by side, their conversations became longer and more personal. At night, by the warmth of the fire, Sarah would talk about her life, her dreams of joining the Coast Guard, the friends she had left behind, and the professional distance she had always maintained to be taken seriously in a male-dominated field. Ethan, in turn, shared his own story, his deep-seated loneliness, his longing for a family, and the bitter taste of rejection he had experienced back in Port Harbor. He confessed his fears and hopes, not as a fisherman talking to a police officer, but as a man talking to a woman who was slowly becoming his confidant. The island had stripped them of their titles and social classes. They were no longer Officer Hayes and Ethan the fisherman. They were simply Sarah and Ethan, two people relying on each other for survival. The initial tension gave way to a quiet, unspoken trust. One evening, after a particularly long day, Sarah looked at him as he tended to the fire. His face, usually so serious, was relaxed and peaceful. For the first time since she had been stranded, a genuine, warm smile touched her lips. She realized that she was no longer angry. In this strange, isolated world, she had found an unexpected sense of comfort and a bond she never thought she would have. The months they spent on the island had transformed them. The isolation, once a source of terror, had become a sanctuary, stripped of the labels and expectations of the outside world. They had found a connection that was pure and unburdened. They were simply two people who had found solace in each other. Their bond had grown into something profound, a quiet, undeniable love that transcended their pasts and their age difference. One night, as they sat by the fire, bathed in the soft glow of the moon, Sarah looked at Ethan. "I don't know what will happen when we get back," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "but I don't think I'll ever be the same." Ethan took her hand, his fingers tracing the calloused lines of her palm. "Me neither," he said, his voice husky with emotion. I spent my whole life feeling invisible, and here, you made me feel seen." In that moment of perfect intimacy and trust, Ethan knew he had to tell her the truth. It was a risk that could destroy everything they had built, but he couldn't let their love be founded on a lie. He took a deep breath. "Sarah, there's something you need to know. The engine. It wasn't a random accident. I broke it on purpose." The words hung in the air like a ghost. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, her hand pulling away from his. "What? Ethan, what are you saying?" she asked, a cold tremor in her voice. He looked at her, his heart pounding. "I was so desperate. I knew you'd never give a fisherman a second glance. I saw my chance, and I took it. I wanted you to be here, with me, so you could see the real me." Sarah was speechless, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. The initial shock gave way to a wave of betrayal. He had lied to her. He had put them both in danger. But as she looked at his earnest, pained expression, she saw no malice, only raw honesty. She remembered the months they had spent together, the way he had cared for her, protected her, and taught her to survive. This wasn't the act of a manipulative villain. It was the desperate, foolish act of a man in love. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "You really are crazy, Ethan," she whispered, the anger replaced by a mix of awe and a strange, quiet acceptance. "But I understand. And somehow, I'm not even angry." Her confession was all he needed. Their hands met again, this time with a deeper understanding. Their love was no longer just a consequence of their isolation. It was a choice, a bond forged in fire. Weeks passed and their love deepened. The island was no longer just a place of survival. It was a home. But then, a new, completely unexpected reality began to take hold. Sarah started feeling unwell, a persistent nausea in the mornings, a strange fatigue that wouldn't go away. At first, she dismissed it as a simple stomach bug. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to notice a change in her body, the subtle roundness of her stomach, a feeling of life growing inside her. The realization hit her like a wave. She was pregnant, here on this remote island, with no one but Ethan. The news was overwhelming, a terrifying, impossible miracle. Her mind raced with questions. How could she give birth? What if something went wrong? But as she felt a faint flutter in her womb, her fear was replaced by a powerful sense of joy. That night, as she told Ethan the news, his face lit up with a mix of shock and pure, unadulterated happiness. He pulled her into his arms, his tears mingling with hers. They were no longer just two people stranded on an island. They were going to be a family. A new, precious life was growing inside her, a testament to the love that had been born out of his reckless act. They now had a reason to hope, and a new life to fight for. Months passed, and Sarah's pregnancy progressed. The once terrifying reality of giving birth on the island was now a part of their daily routine. Ethan worked tirelessly, building a small, makeshift cradle from woven branches and finding foods he hoped would be good for her and the baby. Their love, born from isolation and desperation, was now as strong as the ancient trees around them. Then, one quiet morning, a sound they had almost forgotten cut through the silence, the deep, steady thrum of a boat engine. Sarah and Ethan both froze. They ran to the shoreline, their hearts pounding in unison. On the horizon, a large Coast Guard vessel was approaching, its lights flashing in the distance. They had been found. After all this time, their rescue had finally arrived. As the boat pulled up to the shore, several officers emerged, their faces a mix of shock and relief. Sarah's superior officer, Commander Miller, was among them. His eyes widened when he saw her. "Officer Hayes, we never give up hope," he exclaimed. Then his gaze fell to her visibly pregnant belly and to the man standing protectively beside her. The commander's face, a second ago full of joy, now held a look of utter confusion. The return to Port Harbor was a whirlwind. The news of Officer Hayes' survival spread like wildfire, but it was the story of her pregnancy and her relationship with Ethan that became a sensation. The town, once so quick to dismiss him, was now fascinated by the man who had survived with her. The media hounded them, their lives suddenly under a microscopic public eye. Sarah's career was at risk, and Ethan's past as a poor fisherman was a subject of much gossip. But through it all, they stood together. In official inquiries, Sarah refused to file a complaint against Ethan, explaining that his act, while reckless, had led them to a happiness she never thought possible. Their love, born from a desperate gamble, had become something that couldn't be denied. A few months later, in a proper hospital, their journey culminated in a single, life-changing moment. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The first cries of their son filled the room, bringing a joy so profound it washed away all the public scrutiny and past hardships. As Ethan held the tiny baby in his arms, his eyes filled with tears. "He's perfect, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. They named him Caleb, a name that means wholehearted, a fitting tribute to a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of places. Sarah, after her maternity leave, returned to the Coast Guard. The scandal had faded, replaced by respect for her resilience and strength. Ethan, no longer just a fisherman, used his new life to build a better future for his family. He eventually bought a larger boat and started a small charter business, no longer just hauling fish, but sharing his profound knowledge of the sea with tourists and scientists. Their story became a legend in Port Harbor. It was a testament to the fact that destiny sometimes has its own way of bringing people together. Their island, once a prison, had become a sacred place where two lost souls, a police officer and a fisherman, found not only each other, but also their true purpose. They were a family, forged not in a perfect world, but in a wilderness of their own making, a love story as timeless as the ocean itself.